two candidates don't meet the criteria of integrity.
We need a people's party.
In terms of the lobbyists who are hired primarily by corporations for their own interests.
They're up for sale. They tied to big money.
Frustrated by deep divisions in America's two-party political system, the Movement for a People's Party held its first convention seeking an alternative choice, a new major party free of corporate money and influence. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. On the heels of the Democratic and Republican national conventions, more than 800,000 Americans tuned in for the People's Convention, which aims to form an alternative major political party. The event was organized by the Movement for a People's Party, which was founded by former staff, delegates and volunteers from Senator Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, who are critical of the Democratic Party for what they say is a long-standing allegiance to corporate power, oligarchy and militarism. Over 99% of the convention's registered participants voted in favor of forming a major new party, the People's Party, in 2021. The movement says it is now working on the establishment of local branches across U.S. cities and securing ballot access. So could the Movement for a People's Party, the MPP, break America's long-standing de facto two-party system? I'm now joined by the founder and national coordinator of the Movement for a People's Party, Nick Brana. Nick Brana, a lot of young Americans, especially the Bernie supporters, want a third major party that will represent them, not the interests of the elites in both parties. But can this really happen? Can you really displace an existing establishment party?
Not only can it happen, it is happening. We just brought together for the People's Convention about a week ago, we brought together the former co-chair of the Bernie Sanders campaign, Nina Turner. We brought together one of the greatest philosophers in the United States and possibly the world, Dr. Cornel West, and many other speakers who came together to discuss the formation of a major new party. Two former presidential candidates, Marianne Williamson and Mike Gravel, and also many other speakers, Jesse Ventura, the former governor, and many others. And so we're making it happen right now. And there is a mass desire, a 57% majority of Americans who want a major new party at this point. Because
well, you say there's a massive desire, but will the system, the two-party system, which has long been built on this strategic equilibrium between the two main parties, allow a third major party here in the United States?
Not willingly, but it will happen regardless because the desire for it is so immense at this point. Because the two parties during this neoliberal period in the United States have seen the cost of healthcare, the cost of education, higher education explode. You've seen inequality explode. You've seen political corruption explode. The amount of money that's being spent on politics is tremendous. And so there's an overwhelming consensus in the country now that we need a new direction, and that's going to take a major new party.
And clearly there's been a significant rise among the progressives here in the U.S., progressives within the Democratic Party. There are also these divisions within the Republican Party that are leading so many young voters to want a third way. They show the problems and limitations that come with this two-party system. And in fact, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's one of the best-known progressives in the House, probably said it best when she said this earlier this year: Democrats can be too big of a tent. In any other country, Joe Biden and I would not be in the same party, but in America, we are. So despite some of the overtures made by the Biden campaign to progressives, are they really genuinely welcomed into this big tent?
No, not at all. The dividing line is whether you take corporate money. And the reality is that the difference between the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States is just illusory. They can essentially be considered part of the same party. The only difference, the really significant difference, is those who do not take corporate money. That's the true dividing line. And that's why the party that we're forming is a major new party that is, as a fundamental bedrock principle, free of corporate money.
Well, you've got all these differences with the Democratic Party, which you also say is beholden to corporate money, but there is this marriage of convenience, for now at least. One of the main speakers at the People's Convention, which you put together, was Dr. Cornel West. He said that the choice this election is between a fascist and a neoliberal. Will most progressives, those who signed up to the People's Party, still vote for Biden in November, do you think?
Perhaps. What we're saying officially is we're encouraging people as the Movement for a People's Party to vote their conscience in this election. But what is most important is that we never find ourselves in this situation again in this country with two corporate candidates that get worse every 4 years for the past 40 years, and that we break this cycle instead. We find the off-ramp, and that be a major new party.
And as you say, most Americans want to break this cycle. In fact, according to the latest available data, 11% of Americans believe the two-party system actually works well, and close to 40% believe it is broken and the country needs that third party. The People's Convention spoke of abolishing corruption and restoring democracy. Your platform said that the political system is awash in corporate and billionaire money, that Americans no longer have elections, they have auctions. Politicians say what their voters want to hear and do what their donors want to see. But what would fundamentally change if a new major party is formed, if the rules that have led to this rampant corruption, as you call it, still exist?
Well, originally, the People's Party would not voluntarily not accept corporate donations, while the two parties would continue to be fueled by massive amounts of corporate donations from Wall Street and billionaires. But as Bernie Sanders proved through his two presidential runs in 2016 and 2020, there is a massive desire for politicians and a party that does not take corporate money and is not compromised by those interests, and as a result, can serve working people with integrity.
But wouldn't it be better and more efficient to work to actually reform the Democratic Party? Is it beyond repair?
That's been tried for the past 40 years, even longer, since the end of since the New Deal in the 1930s in the United States, and it has resulted in the kind of duopoly that is fully controlled by big money and Wall Street that we have now.
And in your platform, you actually mention a study that was conducted by Princeton University a few years ago, which concluded that the US is an oligarchy, not a democracy, that it is dominated by a rich and powerful elite. We spoke with the National Coordinator for Students for a People's Party, and here's what she told us.
Young people across the country are seeking an alternative party simply because we have two options that aren't representative of the people and what they deserve. We have people in office who don't believe in decency, who don't believe in peace, and don't believe in actually putting people over profits. And we have two options that are absolutely incredibly filled with corruption. We have people who have PAC money, who have money from fossil fuel companies. We have pharmaceutical and big pharma money in our politicians, and that ineffably and directly correlates to their lack of accurate representation, because they no longer pledge their allegiance to the people they're representing, but rather the people that are filling their pockets.
It isn't just Amaya, but millions of Americans like her who believe that the Democratic Party too is a corporate-owned party. But how do you change this reality?
We change it by getting started with forming a new party. In the United States, it's a state-by-state process. We'll form state parties in all 50 states, and we'll get on the ballot in all 50 states. And our timeline is that we would like to run congressional candidates in 2022, and then run a presidential candidate in 2024 on all state ballots. And that's when we intend on getting a presence in Congress, and then taking Congress, the Senate, and the White House.
How soon do you hope to be able to do all of this?
In the next 4 years. Changes like this happen very quickly, as they did in Mexico, but not only in abroad, in U.S. history. In U.S. history, some of the greatest achievements and leaps in progress have actually come from independent parties. I would say the large majority of them, for example, women's suffrage, the abolition of slavery, which came when the early Republican Party that elected Abraham Lincoln displaced the Whig Party. And so we believe that can happen again. That was done in 4 years, and we believe it can happen again when people reach a certain level of frustration.
You say they can happen again, but some of the key issues that many progressives have cared about for years, and that people in most Western democracies not just care about, but actually have, are still unresolved. Take the single-payer healthcare, free public college, money out of politics, an infrastructure jobs program, the minimum wage that you'd like to see at $15, financial regulations, and so much more. Why are these aims so difficult to attain here in the United States? And do you seriously think that 4 years is enough to make enough change?
We believe that it is, and we believe that it can be done, because these are policies that are common sense. Some of them are taken for granted in the rest of the world. The United States is one of the only countries in the world, developed countries, that does not provide some form of single-payer health care. This has become exacerbated by the fact that we have the pandemic, and the response to the pandemic has been absolutely horrific in the United States. The United States has about a quarter of the world's deaths and cases for having only 4% of the world's population. We have this incredible situation in the United States where more than 1 out of every 10, 40 million Americans, is facing eviction as a result of the incredibly corrupt response from the Democrats or Republicans. There's record child hunger. And so these are conditions that have led people to realize just how corrupt the two-party system is here.
All right, Nick Branna, National Director for the Movement for a People's Party, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
The US political system today is arguably more divided, more polarized than ever before. A recent study by the PEW Research Center on Americans' views of US democracy and the political system, which was published last week, found that a majority, 62% of Americans, say that significant changes are needed in the fundamental design and structure of American government to make it work. Frustrated by the growing acrimony between Republicans and Democrats, an increasing number of Americans are registering as independents rather than Democrats or Republicans under the current electoral system. This year, for the first time in American history, registered independents are outnumbering registered Republicans and Democrats. In a Gallop poll published last month, 26% of voters said they considered themselves Republican, 31% said they were Democrats, and 41% identified as independent. So could this new data suggest the beginning of the end of, in effect, the two-party system? I'm now joined by Gary Johnson, former governor of New Mexico and former presidential nominee for the Libertarian Party in the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections. Governor Johnson, you were a Republican before becoming an independent. Today, the number of registered independents keeps growing. Clearly, people on both sides of the political spectrum don't feel that they truly belong to either one of the two major parties. Now, with the rise of this extreme right and extreme left within both parties, are we beginning to see a fragmentation of the two-party system, which has existed almost for 2 centuries now?
Well, no. And politics is all about money, and Republicans and the Democrats both raise an enormous amount of money. And being a libertarian, being an independent, you would have to be individually wealthy, I think, to mount a credible challenge to become president.
And perhaps the votes that you got, though much better than many of your previous nominees for the Libertarian Party, obviously, but for the other minor parties like the Green parties, show to what extent you have to mount a very robust campaign and to what extent there are still structural obstacles in your way. In your second presidential run, you won 3.3% of the popular vote. That was about 4.5 million votes. Triple the number of votes you got in the previous election, but still just a fraction of what the two main candidates got. It was the best result for a third-party candidate since 1992. Many of us will remember the Texas billionaire Ross Perot ran an independent campaign and won 19% of the vote, but still failed to win a single electoral vote. So can you ever really compete in a system that is structured to favor candidates from the two main parties and discourage seemingly everyone else?
Well, first of all, I think that to win the presidential election, you have to appear in the presidential debates. Who should appear in the presidential debates? In 2012 and 2016, the Libertarian Party, represented by me, was the only party was on the ballot in all 50 states. So in 2012 and 2016, I was the third. There were only 3 candidates on the ballot in all 50 states. I was one of those candidates. The Presidential Debate Commission, you can't become president of the United States if you're not in the presidential debates. Presidential Debate Commission says that you have to be at 15% in the polls to appear in the presidential debates. I have no problem with being 15% in the polls, but how can you be at 15% in the polls when you're not in 99% of the polls that are administered? And that is the unfairness of all this. At some point, you have to draw a line. At what point do you include a third party and make that third party viable? I think it should be the ability to be elected president of the United States.
You mentioned the lack of visibility, the fact that candidates like you could not meet that threshold of 15% in the polls and therefore couldn't have a spot on the national stage, the debate stage.
And how can you get to 15% in the polls if you're not in 99% of the polls that are administered nationwide? You can't.
So it's a catch-22. So what do you then do?
It's a catch-22, exactly. Sounds fair. And it probably would be fair, but once again, if I were to have appeared in all the polls, that would have been almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in that who is this guy? After a certain point, you're going to wonder who Gary Johnson and the Libertarian Party is. My partner Kate got a call from a pollster. The pollster says, who are you going to vote for, Clinton or Trump? She says, I'm going to vote for Gary Johnson. The pollster says, that's not an option. She said, well, I'm going to vote for Gary Johnson, the Libertarian nominee. He said, I'll just put you down as undecided. And I have had other people say the same thing. Once again, being excluded from the polls when you have when you're on the ballot in all 50 states. Not fair.
Well, not fair, you say, and you've tried to change this, but nothing has happened. But beyond the lack of visibility, of attention by the media, there's also the other issues. The fact that there are still to date 48 states that still rely on the winner-takes-all system, which in the end tends to empower a party and a candidate that lack a majority of votes. Yet this is exactly what has happened in several recent elections. Are these rules, these structural obstacles, the lack of federal funding, the lack of access to state ballot registration and those restrictions, are they going to cost votes for any candidate unless they run on a major party ticket?
Yes. You've hit it on the head. Unless you run on a major party ticket or you are individually wealthy enough to compete, it's not going to happen. Trump and Clinton each had $1.8 billion. We had $12 million. We paid $2.67 a vote. Clinton and Trump each paid about $28 a vote. Can't compete.
But isn't the bottom line, though, Governor Johnson, that libertarians, whether they vote Republican or Democratic, and they have tended to vote for either camp. In 2016, the Libertarian Party became the first nationally organized party, other than the 2 major parties, to have 500,000 registered voters. This year, it is likely to be much more with early voter registration. But do you expect that more people will vote for third-party candidates in this election, although it won't be much more than a protest vote in the end? Or will people tend to do what they've done very often in previous elections, which is, once again, choose the lesser of 2 evils?
You've hit it on the head, and you hit it on the head earlier when you talked about all the factors involved in this. And the reality is that it is a 2-party system, and that structurally, for all those things that you mentioned, it's almost impossible to overcome unless you have a personal wealth that allows you to compete from a dollar standpoint. In this election cycle, I think there was one person that was capable of doing that, and that was Michael Bloomberg, and he chose to run as a Democrat, and of course he has thrown his support behind Biden.
Well, does this then mean that voting for a third-party candidate is simply a wasted vote? I mean, we've been hearing about the spoiler effect since Ralph Nader, the Green Party candidate in 2000, was accused of costing the Democratic candidate back then, Al Gore, the vote in Florida and therefore the election. In 2016, you were criticized for taking away crucial votes in some swing states away from Hillary Clinton. Some say that if half of your supporters would have voted for Clinton over Trump, the electoral map would have been decidedly different. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, it's absolutely false. If you would have taken all of my votes and given them to either candidate in any state, it would have not made a difference electoral-wise in any state. And no, it's not a wasted vote. I would argue that my 4.5 million votes were a principled vote, and I'm voting for Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian nominee, as a principled vote. It is not a throwaway vote.
Well, some Democrats say that Hillary Clinton could have won in states like Michigan, which Trump won by just 10,000 votes, Pennsylvania, which he won by 44,000, and Wisconsin, which he won by 22,000 votes. Yet it is Trump, in fact, who seems to still be aggrieved. Here's what he said on August 31st.
If you take a look at the Libertarian, you know, they always talk about Jill Stein. Jill Stein took, what, 0.5%? They talk about Jill Stein. Well, I have a Libertarian. I'm somewhat Libertarian. I have to be honest with you. Rand Paul will tell you that. I have a Libertarian candidate on last time that got, what, 4.5% or so. Those are all Republican voters. They're wasting their vote.
Well, that Libertarian candidate was you. To the president's claim that he is somewhat libertarian, you reacted on Twitter by saying there's nothing libertarian about $26 trillion in debt and immigrants in ramshackle camps on the border. But when President Trump says libertarians should vote Republican, otherwise they'd be wasting their vote, what's your reaction?
Well, first of all, the notion that we should build a wall across the border is anything but libertarian. The notion that immigration is a bad thing is anything but libertarian, and in that regard, Trump is anything but a libertarian.
So his claim that he is somewhat libertarian doesn't really stand, you say. But doesn't this Governor, doesn't this go to show, though, that candidates will join any one of the two major parties, regardless of their ideologies, if that party affiliation gives them the best chance to win? He himself went from being a registered Republican in the late 80s, then an independent, then a Democrat, before becoming a Republican again.
I agree with that. Unless that candidate has a personal wealth that would allow them to compete. 2016, that would have been $1.8 billion. Based on the amount of money that I spent per vote, arguably I might have been able to compete with 150 million.
And as a former Republican, how do you see the shift of the Republican Party away from its original ideologies? The base of the Republican Party has become more entrenched. QAnon, a far-right conspiracy theory, as you know, now has support among a majority of Republican voters. A new poll shows that 56% of Republicans believe that QAnon is mostly or partly true. 1 in 3 Republicans, that's 33%, say they believe the QAnon theory about a conspiracy among deep state elites is mostly true, and another 23% say some parts are true. So it isn't just that these fringe views are becoming mainstream, but that some of the ardent believers, like Marjorie Greene in Georgia, who posted recently a photo of herself with an assault rifle next to 3 congresswomen of color, are poised to become lawmakers within the Republican Party and are hailed by President Trump as future Republican stars.
Well, and that's very disturbing to me as a former Republican. And for me, Republican was all about being conservative. Was all about being fiscally responsible, and the debt that we have right now, at some point, I believe, is going to lead to hyperinflation, and it's just a matter of time. If it weren't for the Federal Reserve and zero interest rates, the cost on the national debt alone would be more than any other single item in the budget.
All right, Governor Gary Johnson, former governor of New Mexico and 2-time presidential candidate, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Now, many in the US label the next presidential contest as, quote, historic, a turning point. As true as this may be, most previous elections have also been cast as historic. But beneath the acrimony of this presidential campaign, which has polarized American society to a level not seen in recent times, this battle for America's soul may produce an outcome that's been attempted before but never achieved. A third way, a third political party capable of challenging today's Republican and Democratic parties, which, as hard as it is to imagine, used to be the Democratic-Republican Party. But that was 2 centuries ago. Today, both major parties are losing steam. More and more Americans identify themselves as independent of the two parties. That critical mass could put into orbit a new third party, breaking the two-party system and paving the way for a much-needed but never seriously attempted reform of an electoral system that does not operate on the basis of one person, one vote. A system that has served the United States for 200 years, but is beginning to undermine the essence of American democracy. Rather than balancing interest, it is allowing the country to drift apart. So in short, the 2020 US elections may well be historic, not because the Republic is in peril, according to either candidate, if their opponent wins, but because an unprecedented number of Americans are no longer ready to listen to and support the traditional political parties with which they no longer identify. Welcome to the rise of the millennials. Tell us what you think. We're on Twitter at _InsideAmerica. From me and the entire team here in Washington, thanks for watching.